Hello, and welcome back to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo, and we are continuing on our Expression Tool expedition. Still looking at the Expression Designer, the main part of the Expression Designer, but we're going to look at enclosures. And you can see in my score here, I've got a bunch of them set up for you can see what's available to you, a bunch of different shapes and how they work. And so let's just dive right into it. I'm going to show you the square one first, so double click that. Now, the enclosure shape is found right here in the center of the window, and the enclosure will only apply to text. So if you choose shapes here, you can't also have an enclosure around a shape, all right? So we're just enclosing the texts. And this menu will give you a bunch of preset options, including square, circle, ellipse, triangle, rectangle, pentagon, hexagon, septagon, octagon, and other will initiate a new custom enclosure. Now, the ones you're probably going to use most often is square, rectangle, and maybe circle as well. Some of the, you can create a septagon enclosure if you want, but that would be a unique thing to see. And if we choose the edit button, now we'll get into the enclosure designer. So we can see a bunch of different options here. And this is where we can customize those preset enclosures. Now, at the very top, you'll get the core shape that you can use, and you can see all these shapes. And notably, you get a rectangle and ellipse, but not a square and a circle. And the reason for that is because a square is a type of rectangle, and a circle is a type of ellipse with a specific thing set to it, and specifically in this option here, we have match height and width. So a rectangle with match height and width would indeed be a square. So that's how that works. Very technical on Finale's part there. Below the core shapes that are available to you is this option for opaque. And let me just cancel out of here and show you the difference. So I've created a couple of expressions here with opaque and non-opaque enclosures. And the non-opaque, you can see all the elements through the enclosure through the expression and in the enclosure. With the opaque enclosure chosen, you can see that it will hide everything behind it, right? So that's what the opaque does. Below the opaque option in the enclosure designer is the line thickness, and this is exactly what it sounds like. You can change the thickness of the line of the enclosure itself, and in fact, I've done that in this expression here where we have a slightly thicker line, and that line happens to be set to 0.02, and that will give you a nice thick line. Interestingly, if you choose a line thickness of 0 with opaque selected, you get something like this where you have a text expression that will hide whatever is behind it, right? So this, I do use this on occasion where you may need to hide something behind it. So this is how you would do that. Set the enclosure to opaque and then set the line thickness to 0, right? Choose a rectangular enclosure, right? Set it to opaque, set the line thickness to 0. So that's a nifty little trick, all right? Below those options in the enclosure designer, we can choose rounded corners, which is actually relatively new to Finale, a couple of versions ago, I believe. We can round the corners, and this center radius or corner radius for the corners value here, just FYI, should probably be fairly small. In this case, I have it set to 0.04. I don't know if you want to go too much more than 0.06. Somewhere between 0.01 and 0.06 will give you some nice rounded corners. And that is how that works. We can customize the enclosures further. There are some problems with the enclosures if you use them as is. For example, this triangle enclosure, you can sort of see that it doesn't exactly work with words. The diamond's a little weird too. So sometimes you do have to adjust them. And let me just show you this triangular enclosure to show you what's going on here. With the triangle, we have the match height and width selected by default, which is problematic because you really have to create a sort of large triangle in order to encompass that entire word, which may not be what you want to do. But what you can do is with these options here, if you choose to enforce minimum width or choose none as opposed to match height and width, then now you can actually kind of adjust that triangle to be however you want it to. So it doesn't have to be completely equilateral. You can see I get a tall triangle or a sort of flat squat triangle just by moving these handles around. And you see the results, you see the results of moving those handles around in the height and width values here. And there is a center H and V. So there's a center handle here, which will actually change where the enclosure is relative to the word itself. So again, you can simply just drag that center handle to change these values, but if you want to go back to 0, you can just type those in, all right? And so this is how you would make those types of adjustments. Let me just show you a couple other things with the enforce or match options here. If I go to the rectangle version here and go to the enclosure designer, so I do have the enforce minimum width here, and basically what this is that if you set these heights and widths here to 0, enforce minimum width is going to, force the enclosure itself to not go any smaller than the word itself, right? So you can sort of see that it's just at the edges of the word. But if we choose none here, now we can, if we choose the right handle to move, we can actually kind of force the enclosure to do some weird things, including make it smaller than the word itself, which is not always great. But if we go back to enforce minimum width, let me just start over with that again. With the enforce minimum width, you'll see that it's much easier to manage around that word. And again, we can sort of choose, the size of this and all that stuff just by moving these handles around. There is a fixed enclosure size option here, and if we choose that, then it's going to sort of ignore all of these other options here, and now we can sort of set the enclosure however we want it to, and no matter what word is typed in there, let me just show you this. So now this rectangle looks like that, and so no matter what word you type in here, if I type a smaller word in here, just the word go, for example, the enclosure will still be the same size, regardless of the fact that the word has gotten smaller. So we can type a really long word in here, and unfortunately that means that it's going to go outside of the boundaries of the rectangle. So sometimes that enforce or sometimes that fixed enclosure is not a great idea. Other times it is a great idea. Particularly with squares in situations like this. You can see the ones on the left here use fixed enclosures. The one on the right use non-fixed enclosures. And, if you're using, for example, these square enclosures for rehearsal numbers or letters or something, so you'd probably want to have these fixed so that the squares themselves don't get any larger as the numbers get larger. Because what Finale is trying to do is it's trying to create the same amount of padding between the edges of the number, and as the numbers get larger, it requires more padding, so the whole enclosure gets bigger. And when it's a square, the height and the width have to be the same, so you can see that the height of the square gets a lot taller as you get larger numbers, which is not always necessarily what you want. So there are occasions to use a fixed enclosure. In fact, with the square specifically, it might be a good idea to use the fixed enclosure. But with the other ones, you probably want to use non-fixed enclosures, because you can see the results of fixed enclosures with rectangles, for example. It's not exactly ideal. All right, so that is the enclosures. It's a little bit complicated, but hopefully this all makes sense. It's easy enough to just choose a preset one, but those are the options available to you in the Enclosure Designer from within the main section of the Expression Designer. We're getting deep into the menus of Finale at this point. So, all right, so I hope that's helped. Come back and we'll look at shapes within the main section of the Expression Designer next. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next video.